responding to a Tech Radar article. Now, I have to actually read the article to you, and I didn't realize that this was a May article, but, since I was reading about Apple and Tech Radar, I came across it. This rotten Apple ruling cracks the reality distortion field, and I don't know if it's what consumers want. Well, it's what I want, by the way, but let's get into this article. Apple does not hide its deeds under a bushel. When it lost the Epic case last year, it quickly rolled out a series of changes to satisfy the injunction. These were remarked upon at the time as malicious compliance, by the way. If no one else realized Apple had somehow won by losing, Epic certainly knew it. With Epic CEO Tim Sweeney stating on X, formerly Twitter, the court battle to open iOS to competing stores and payments is lost in the United States, a sad outcome for all developers. In answer to that ruling, Apple started charging a 27% commission on App Store apps, and that chose to manage their own billing and force them to apply for a special tool that let app developers include a button to outside billing systems. Additionally, Apple required that developers still support Apple's in-app billing system as an alternative to third-party ones. It was all there in black and white, but those decisions triggered what may be one of the most scathing rulings I have ever read. U.S. Judge Court Yvonne Gonzalez Rogers, who's been presiding over this case for years, is pissed, and she's become one of my favorite judges for this ruling. Mine, not the person who wrote this, was Apple trying to follow the letter of the law by skirting around the bits that may have an impact on its commission revenue business. As Judge Gonzalez sees it, yes, well, I do too. Don't believe me? Rule this unedited bit from the court ruling. In stark contrast to Apple's initial in-court testimony, contemporary business documents reveal that Apple knew exactly what it was doing and at every turn chose the most anti-competitive option. Fair. Completely objective and fair. To hide the truth, Vice President of Finance Alex Rodman outright lied under oath. True. Internally, Philip Schiller had advocated that Apple comply with the injunction, but Tim Cook ignored Schiller and instead allowed Chief Financial Officer Luca Masteri and his finance team to convince him otherwise. Cook chose poorly. I agree. The real evidence, therefore, herein, more than meets the clear and convincing standard to find a violation. The court refers this matter to the Attorney General in the Northern District of California to investigate whether criminal contempt proceedings are appropriate. As the judge sees it, Apple may have used this ruling to further enrich its commission business. This is literal criminal conduct that we're talking about. Prior to the injunction, Apple did not allow linked out purchases and thus did not charge any commission for purchases made outside of or off its platform. Now it does. The filing shows how Apple worked to fulfill the injunction in such a way that one may be opening new third-party billing and revenue service avenues to developers. It also solidified Apple's hold on the process and commission collection. Judge Gonzalez paints this as a pretty nefarious operation, with Apple willfully hiding and lying about its intentions. And then it basically tries to say that Apple never lied about its intentions regarding the App Store. And yet, here we are. It's doing exactly what I've said the whole time. The argument that they're making, Apple likes full stack control for well control, but so it can also fulfill its security and privacy promises. An app store where you can trust the majority of apps is not something that occurs naturally. The one thing that I'm thinking with this is that there's too many submissions to the App Store for app reviewers to give it any more than 10 minutes of time, if even. You're talking about your 2 minutes of time for your app to be reviewed in the store. Do you really think that they're able to find out and suss out all the potential security vulnerabilities within 2 minutes? No, this is just pure security theater. There are tons and tons of insecure apps that make it straight through that net, but Apple has somehow distorted reality so that people feel safe with this. You must set the parameters and ensure that every app that passes through those narrow gates does what it's promised and is free from malware and spyware. Well, they don't do that. in practice, there are too many apps submitted for them to actually achieve the end to make sure that all the apps that are submitted are free from malware and spyware. It's no accident that your best iPhone is not riddled with malware, or that you rarely download a fake app. Does anyone remember the early days of Android apps before Google Play? The more open Apple is with its platform, the more risk it occurs for itself and its customers. Again, this is all just security theater. It's theater. It's pretending to be more secure. They're not actually more secure. It's also clear, though, that Apple doesn't think much about methods or perception. If it was being forced to give third-party fulfillment systems access to App Store customers, then why not charge third-party developers for the pleasure? After all, the links to these platforms would come through Apple. Was that a deterrent to the development of such systems? Probably. Was that Apple's intention? I don't know. If you believe the injunction, you know some within Apple knew that Apple's methods of compliance were too close to following with the law. Those voices, though, did not win. Former Apple CFO, Luca Mastori, once a voice of reason on Apple's earnings calls, is named the key champion of potentially bad ideas. As for what Apple does next, well, I'm sure it will fight, but there's also no way it can ignore Judge Gonzalez's closing statement. This is an injunction, not a negotiation. There are no do-overs once a party willfully disregards a court order. Time is of the essence. The court will not tolerate further delays. As previously ordered, Apple will not impede competition. The court enjoins Apple from implementing its new anti-competitive acts to avoid compliance with the injunction. Effectively, immediately, Apple will no longer impede developers' ability to communicate with users, nor will they levy or impose new commissions on on-off purchases. What happens next? If this ruling holds, which is not a certainty as Apple plans to appeal, it may trigger sweeping changes that could forever alter the way that we use the App Store. Again, this has always been mere security theater. The loss of a fully closed system may not be the best thing for consumers. Oh, God, it is. Still, it gives developers the flexibility that many have been craving and effectively takes the Apple Commission, aka the Apple tax, off the table for transactions happening outside the platform, even if users found that link from inside Apple's App Store. Epic is already planning for the best case scenario and quickly announced Fortnite will return to the App Store next week, which I'm sure in-app purchases, those skins, all taking you outside Apple's platform. We will return to Fortnite. We will return Fortnite to the U.S. Basically. So, this may be the first effective crack in Apple's reality distortion field, one that refashions reality to suit its needs. We've seen this work this year with Apple not delivering the full Apple Intelligence experience, but telling consumers that the iPhone 16 comes with it. It has since quietly removed some of that language from the product page. Apple has rarely admitted mistakes or shortcomings, and while this ruling isn't a sign that Apple will start now, it appears to have no choice but to deconstruct the distortion revealed. It built around app developer choice. As the injunction reads, like the final word on the subject, Apple willfully chose not to comply with the court's injunctions. It did so with the express intent to create new anti-competitive barriers which would, by design and in effect, maintain a valued revenue stream, a revenue stream previously found to be anti-competitive. That is, though, this court would tolerate that it thought that this court would tolerate such insubordination was a gross miscalculation. As always, the cover-up made it worse. For this court, there's no second bite at the apple. Ouch. So, my statement about all this in response to, Tech Radar is, in summary, Lance Ulanoff, who submitted this opinion piece to Tech Radar, for one thing, thank God I have my own platform to respond to things like this. But moving on, Lance, you should have done more research before you put this one opinion piece to Tech Radar. You would have discovered that very little time is actually given to the review of apps, and that there are so many apps that are submitted to the App Store that they may spend maybe 2 minutes, if even, reviewing apps, which is not really sufficient time to fully audit the code of an application. That shit takes time. to do, and far too much is submitted to the App Store to do a proper code audit on everything that is submitted to it. So there are many things that actually pass through the cracks in the App Store. If you haven't fallen victim to one of them, you're lucky in two ways. For one thing, iOS has a lot of security features that are built into it, on top of, the app, just curating the App Store to a limited extent. So it's a relatively more, it has a lot of security. But the thing is that Android is the same way. Like for instance, some of the security features that are on here pretty much ensure that, something can maybe get into the computer, temporarily, as far as things, but they will not survive a reboot of the system, with Android. Like, gaining persistence the way that you could on a computer, turning it into a full bot where your malware survives, a reboot, is just not easily achieved on either one of these platforms. These are just, the security hardening that's happened on these systems. And so, the recommendation is that you reboot your phone every so often, just in case if anything happens. But they don't spend a lot of time, on reviewing apps. It's not like they go through the code line by line by line and looking for malicious code, because you can't do that in 2 minutes. So this idea that they're spending a lot of time, reviewing apps, is just the perspective of somebody that hasn't actually spent a lot of time studying the issue. You should have done your due diligence on that one. Just saying, as a point of criticism of this Tech Dirt article. The other thing that I'm left, saying in response to this is, I mean, I was cheering for this ruling. I was quite happy and thrilled to see it. In fact, I was actually happy to see, them actually refer this matter to the criminal division and everything, because this was potentially a crime, was committed here, especially if if their officers, perjured themselves before the court, on this one. This is a very significant, a thing that happened, and it's pretty horrible. And the other thing that I was left, with, and trying to say in response to this, is that when you say Apple likes full stack control, well, control so that it can fulfill its security and privacy promises. An app store where you can trust the majority of apps is not something that occurs naturally. You must set the parameters and ensure that every app that... Anyways, they don't actually achieve that in practice, but also on top of that, this approach to security is a lot like refusing to sell somebody knives because they might cut themselves with them. It's true, perhaps, that if you allow people to do things like install custom firmware on their phones, they might install malware firmware, to their phone and everything, and that they might choose a bad firmware that, turns their phone against the user and everything, and on accident, unintentionally. They might sneak a Trojan horse in that way. But you're not giving the user the choice or option to take that responsibility on for themselves and to figure out these things out for themselves. You don't even give them the choice. And the thing about tech in particular is that most people don't tinker with things unless they know what they're doing. For the most part, the public has taken a if it isn't broken, don't fix it approach to technology. And so what that means is that for the average user, you don't go in and reflash the firmware on a phone unless you basically understand the process and what you're doing. Now, I had a different approach. I was a tinkerer. I've always been a tinkerer. I know what, but I've gained enough experience as a consequence of that, that I know what I'm doing when it comes to reflashing firmware. In fact, I literally went out and got an uninterruptible power supply because I knew that in the future I may be, reflashing firmware more often and more frequently, and so I knew that I didn't want to have to rely on the power grid, when I was doing it, because the consequences of a power outage could be catastrophic when you're reflashing firmware. You know, I have been doing this for a very long time. I first got experience. So, the context in which I first grabbed experience when it came to reflashing firmware was a very long time ago. I was about 13 or 14, but I had basically I had a PlayStation, but I had one of the old models where you had the port on the back that the old, the Game Sharks would plug into the backside of the thing with. There was that port, the serial port on the back of the damn PlayStation 1. you know, well, if you paid attention, you would notice that those cartridges that those things came in, some of the old style, also had a printer. Uh, it was the same cable that the old style of printers used to communicate between the two, but they could also be used for other communications purposes for other devices. So these were serial cables, but it would plug into the backside of the PlayStation, and then you would plug into the cartridge itself, and you would run that wire to your computer, right? Well, those cartridges were easy to reprogram and reflash with different firmware, right? And I caught wind of this one, Catella, which enabled you to, input action replay codes and Game Shark codes or whatever at the time, but also stop the disc and swap it out with a different one, and so you could play, backups of games that you had made and everything. And so I reflashed the firmware of the damn thing over to Catella. I went through the process, downloaded the flasher, did the reflashing process and everything, and over time I also sometimes occasionally update my laptop BIOS, and I've learned as a result of all this and reading the warnings that they issue, don't power off your PC, that if there's a catastrophic loss of power when you're in the reflashing process, you will brick your computer. I have enough experience doing reflashing that I know what I'm doing. So, I don't appreciate this kind of thing. I want to be able to reflash the firmware on my phone. I know that there's a danger there. I know that I might actually, if I wasn't paying attention, I could reflash it with something that's very, very bad firmware. At the same time, I understand the risks that are involved. I understand that you could brick your device if you don't, constantly supply it with power. I understand that, on top of all of that, you could potentially install malware, as well. I know this, I know these risks, but I don't appreciate being told by a company that I can't make them. I can't make that decision for myself. I don't want this kind of paternalism, myself ruling over what I do with my device. Now, maybe there are some people who want that kind of paternalism, but I'm not one of them.